Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna put the slides online after the talk, so you can look at them then before you go to sleep tonight. I don't usually introduce myself, but I thought after that talk I probably should say something. I'm co-founder and an organizer of a group called Queer Code, which is a group for queer people who want to write code together. And it's very important for people from marginalized groups to have a space where they can meet with each other and feel free to work together without having to explain themselves. And we actually just started a chapter here, so there's Queer Code Yorkshire now. And I would definitely encourage you, if you know any queer people or LGBT people, please tell them about Queer Code. Tell them to go and look it up, because it's such a great thing for queer people. And I'll speak more about what I do in the end. But I work for a company called Eighth Light in London. We're a consultancy, and I also just started this site, reacttdd.com, which is based on this talk. So I'm going to put together some screencasts to explain all of this stuff in detail. So if you are more interested, you can sign up there. And when they're online in the next month, you can follow along. So yeah, I started writing JavaScript about a year ago. I had actually done some JavaScript 5, is it called? Way before that. But I hated it. I really decided I was not a JavaScript programmer. And then I suddenly realized that my client wanted me to write some JavaScript. And so for the last year, I've been writing JavaScript. And I guess the first thing about that is I started with an opinion. Right? I started thinking, oh, I hate JavaScript. I don't want to be writing this code. I think a lot of people start that way. So a lot of the code that you'll see in these slides is kind of from my journey over the past year. And I don't know if you've heard of the 5 stages of grief, or anger, denial, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Well, I think I definitely spent a lot of time in the bargaining zone. I like closure. I write a lot of closure. And there was a point where, somebody laugh, there's a point when I realized JavaScript is very Lispy. There's a lot of functional stuff there. And so I kind of consoled myself, saying, oh, this is just Lisp. It's not really. But I spent a lot of time there. And then I think this talk and the work I do now, kind of discussing how I write JavaScript, is my acceptance, maybe. So I'm a minimalist. I don't really like code. I'm very happy when I get to delete code. A good day for me is when I go into a code base and I delete more code than I add. That's a great day. I love that feeling. And hopefully that's reflected in this code. And I'm also steady with my code, and that's something that comes with test-driven development. Who here is familiar with TDD? Anybody do that regularly? Okay, cool. Thanks. So Eighth Light kind of wrote the book on TDD, and we all follow it religiously, strict TDD. I love it. So the way I write code doesn't necessarily mean it's the right way to write code. It's my way. So hopefully you can look at these examples and use it to inform your own code. You might hate it. Yeah, I'm going to skip that. So if you follow along the screencast, what I'm building is a meal planner, but really at this stage it's just recipes. So the code samples I'm talking about today all come from this particular screen, where there's a list of recipes, and you can click on a recipe to view the recipe. So we're not even going to get into adding new recipes, but we'll look at ingredients, how in React we can structure this view. So first of all, I want to talk about TDD before we even look at React. So we want to have a way of formatting our ingredients list. So here on the right, I've got the way that I'm storing this on a server. So it's a JSON document. So you can make a request to the server for a recipe, and it will come back with a document which includes a list of ingredients. some of these ingredients just have names, so puff based there. Some have an amount as well, and others have a measure. So depending on what you've got, that can be formatted quite differently. And even a 0.5 would actually be converted to a half mark. So this is a great exercise for learning TDD. So the function that I'm using to craft that is called format ingredient requirement, and it takes 3 parameters. One is the ingredient, so that's that object that I just showed you, that JSON object that I just showed you, and 2 other things, an ingredient finder and a measure finder. And in the workshop code, if you look at it, the ingredient finder and the measure finder also make web requests to get information about an ingredient and a measure. So for example, if I say my ingredient is 2 apples, I can look at the ingredient finder to find out more about apples. And if I say I need 2 teaspoons of milk, talk. But yes, this is a great example of a stub. And we can use that, so for the test, we want to use that to find out what the plural is. Here's my code from that second test expands to in, then I get a string of 1 onion returned. And if it's 2, then it's going to look up using the ingredient finder and put that amount in the plural form in. So I'll get 2 onions. Yeah, so this syntax is confusing to anybody. This is string interpolation in JavaScript. It's different from every other language that does string interpolation. Triple equals, great. Lots of fun stuff here. Okay, so this is how we do TDD. We look at each of the kind of sample specifications that we have, and we just directly translate them to tests, and we only write the minimum amount of code required to make the test pass. So with Jasmine, here's how I would format my test structure. I don't really know much about test frameworks for JavaScript. I use Jasmine. But the thing about unit test frameworks is they should all be the same. They all act in the same way. So I imagine you can do all the same things in any framework you're choosing to use. And that's also true for the approach that I'm following when I write my React code. I don't really, I just started writing React code. And I did it using the same principles that I used to write TDD code in every language with every framework. It's the same process. And that's, when I use React Test Utils over something like Enzyme, I know I can do it in React Test Utils. I know I could also do it in Enzyme, but there's a kind of fun in learning and applying the same techniques that I already know from other languages. So hopefully that'll come across. Jasmine, I don't know if you can see it at the back, but this is how we kind of structure our test file. At the very top, I'm going to put the dependencies that I need inside of my function that I'm testing, or my React component. I'm going to put them at the very top, and they're used in every test, so I suck them out of the tests. I want to dry up my tests. I want my tests to be as descriptive about what they're testing as possible. So it's not production code. I don't necessarily care that maybe some tests aren't using these, or that they're not declared at the point they're actually used. What I want is my test description, so the things in the if blocks to be as short and descriptive as possible. So get all of the setup out of those. At the top, I'll declare the variables I'm going to use, and then at the bottom, I'll have my helper functions. So that's kind of how I structure my test files. And then with functions, this is a really simple way of thinking about your code. A function just has inputs and outputs, and in JavaScript, even your React components, you can think of them like this. That's kind of one of the purposes, one of the ways that React was designed, right? That it's kind of functional. So we can think of these black boxes when we're testing. We don't really care how our function works inside. We just care about the inputs and the outputs. So, for example, we saw that test where I put in an object of name onion and amount 2, and I got a string 2 onions. I don't care how it works. And then the gray boxes there, I'm passing into functions as well. So functions, you can pass in functions. So I passed in an ingredient finder and a measure finder. And that's how we compose software. We pass functions into functions. So the function at the top is the ingredient finder. It takes an onion and tells me what the plural of onion is. It's onions. And I have the measure finder, which takes a teaspoon and tells me that the plural of that is teaspoons. So, eventually you can repeat this test structure, and you end up with code like this. You don't need to see what it says. But I think what's interesting, you probably can see from the back, is that I've got 3 functions here. So already with this very small piece of functionality, I've split this out into 3 even smaller functions. There's only one level of indent in each of these. So already you can see 2 of the rules that I follow when I'm writing what I consider simple code. Very, very short functions. These are about the length of every function I would write. And there's only ever one level of indent. And the beauty of TDD is if you have the test describing your code before you write the code, then you're free to refactor it however you see fit. So you can make a mess up front and then refactor later to fit a very kind of beautiful structure. Okay, so this is already a lot of code. It's already a lot to take in, the essence of TDD. But we're going to repeat and go over it again multiple times. So let's move on to React. So who doesn't know React? Okay, a few. So I'm going to talk about it, and hopefully it's a good refresher for those of you who do know it. So the main thing here is the render. Each React component is responsible for rendering some HTML. That's what its job is there to do. Our React components are classes. they're probably the only time that I'll write classes in JavaScript. I much prefer a functional approach. But yes, React wants classes. You can write components which are not classes, but actually they are not kind of, they're more difficult with testing. So a lot of the time I'll use classes. And these classes all have a render method. So every component has a render method. And it's got this funny thing in here, which is JSX. So yeah, the React team thought it would be a great idea if we could write HTML inside of our JavaScript. You know, at first I hated it. I absolutely hated it. I thought, why would anybody want to do this? You know, this is a ridiculous idea. Kind of coming around to the idea. So this is not actually HTML. These are creating React elements. So you can do this without JSX. This is the one thing that I see everybody trip up with when they start writing React. JSX. You know, people try to put comments in the middle of it. You can't do that. They try to write. So these things are curly braces. So I can write some types of code within my JSX. So here I'm mapping over my recipes, which I'll talk about. But you can't just write any code in here. So it's limited what kind of statements you can put inside your JSX. So I mentioned the recipes there. So what this component is doing is taking that recipe list. Remember I showed you the lists of recipes on the left? That's going to display that list. And it's just an unordered list. And here I'm taking the recipes which are passed in as a property, a prop, into the constructor. And it's mapping over them, and each of them is a list item. You can see, again, I've split out that into two functions. Splitting a function out of your render is a great way to escape the JSX parsing. So if you do want to do some computation inside of your render, just call out to another function, and then suddenly you're not in the JSX world. So I do this quite a lot. That's a really good trick. But yeah, again, splitting out lots of methods. So what are these properties? Well, so in my recipe list, I could pass in that array of recipes, and I have it available as this .props. So that's one of the main things we use, and we'll look at that a little bit later. How do we actually use the component? Well, at some point in our JavaScript, we have to call react-dom.render, and we give it an actual DOM element. So this document is the kind of main API in JavaScript in the browser. We actually get our div or whatever we're mounting. And in our tests, we do actually the same thing. We create an element. So before each is just a way of running code before each test. We use that to always create a fresh DOM element for every test to run independently in. So every test has its own container, and we render the element inside of that container in exactly the same way we do in our production code. So even in React Test Utils, there are methods to help you render. I don't use them. I just use the standard. There's no need to use those methods. Even shallow rendering that you see in Enzyme, don't use it. You can get away without using that. You'll see how. So yes, exactly the same code you're running in production. And you can see here hopefully you can see I'm constructing a recipe list component with JSX, and I'm passing in this recipe repository equals repository. So I'm passing in a property here. So that's a property being passed in. It's just like a constructor, a variable being passed into the constructor. I use JS DOM, so I don't know, are people familiar with that? Yeah? No? So JS DOM is just an implementation of this document. So when I say global.document, JS DOM is giving me an implementation of the document API that your browsers will as well. That's all it does. And in order to get that, I have my own reset DOM method. So I've got my own little method that constructs JS DOM within every test. Okay, so let's go back to the testing then. exactly the same as how we just test standard JavaScript functions. We start with our variables that we need inside of every test. So I'm going to have a component. All my React tests, you're going to see me define a component that I can use in my tests. I define it outside of the test because all my tests need a component. So that gets again, that's like sucking that kind of common verbiage out of my tests. And any commonality that I'm going to pass into the constructors, I'm going to pull that out as well. So we'll talk about repositories later. Let's look at the test. That's the interesting thing. So it initially displays an empty unordered list. So I'm going to construct a recipe list component. And before it even goes to the server to retrieve what recipes the server knows about, it's going to the component is going to show an empty list. So it doesn't know about any recipes initially. It has to make an asynchronous call to the server in order to find those recipes. Now initially, what's it going to render? But you'll know it's a really simple test. And in fact, this code is exactly how my production code works. When I'm writing production code for my clients, this is exactly, all my tests look exactly like this. So often when I see the tests that people are writing, they're very complicated. And your tests do not need to be complicated. 3 lines in test is good. So we've already seen the mount component method. That was the one in the previous slide where I call React DOM.render. Then I'm calling expect. So these are my assertions. I've got a method here called ul. That's my unordered list. So I've got a method which is going to return me the DOM node from my unordered list, and I'll look at that. So, but if you read this test, it says I expect an unordered list to be defined, and I expect my unordered list children.length to equal 0. So notice I'm using standard DOM API calls, so the children property and the length property on children in my tests. I'm not scared of them. I actually want to get to that point as quickly as possible, because the DOM API is well understood and it's complete. The React Test Utils API, not so much. So as soon as I can get to using the DOM, I much prefer that, definitely. The whole point about React is to construct HTML. And that's what I want to test. In this case, I want to say, okay, this component creates me an empty, unordered list. So here's that function ul, unordered list. And I'm using the first React Test Utils function we've seen. It says find render DOM component with tag. I think this is one reason why people don't really like using React Test Utils. You can just hide these calls in your own methods. Right? So that's what I'm doing here with the ul. I don't want this in my test. I definitely do not want this method call in my test. It's descriptive, that's great, but it's not at the right level of abstraction for my test. I don't care about React in my test. I care that there's an unordered list. So push that into a method. And then I can forget about it. And actually, I always have a whole load of little methods that look like this. And the way this works is it will look at the component that I've defined, so that class, that instance of that class, and it will look at what's rendered in its kind of render tree and find an element which is a ul. Okay, so here's our recipe list, and what's going to happen is you click on a recipe, and it's going to load that recipe in our recipe component. So there's asynchronous behavior there, right? So first of all, we had the recipe list to load, and now when we click on a recipe, we need to load a recipe, and there calls to the server. And so this is kind of common to every web app, right? You've got to make asynchronous calls. Jasmine, we use this done terminal, this kind of done syntax to deal with the asynchronous nature of some calls. The golden rule of all testing is you never let your code be asynchronous. You do not want your code to be asynchronous. Now, unfortunately, with JavaScript, that's not possible. The way the whole language is built makes that impossible. If you go to a language like Java or C#, they've got mechanisms to turn asynchronous code into synchronous code. The difficulty with asynchronous code is you can't reason about it very definitely. So you're opening yourself to intermittent failures. And one way that people get around it is to add sleeps to the test code. You definitely never want to do that. And that is the worst thing you can do in testing, right? Is add a sleep to your test. Because you want your test to run very, very quickly. But people do it because they don't know how to handle the asynchronous behavior. But JavaScript does have this mechanism built into it. Again, you don't need frameworks to do it for you. We have the set immediate function. This is just a JavaScript function which says, okay, I want you to run this code after everything else which is in the queue to run has run. So when I'm mounting my component, when I'm mounting my React component, it is going to put things on the asynchronous queue to do. It's not going to actually, when you construct your objects, you might make asynchronous calls to load data, and they will go on the queue of work to do. The code after your mount component will run before that code. So if you want it to run after, you need to put it in the set immediate block. And a lot of my tests have this. You can, if you want, you could also wrap this in a method and make it a nicer API. I actually prefer to just quite see it out in the open. But this is the basic structure. You need to tell Jasmine when you're actually done. So it gives you this variable. And you call it, it's a function, and you call it when your test is actually done. So I'm putting something on this queue of things to do, and the test will not be pass or fail until that call is run. So here's how we would use it. If my test is a recipe list, where I want the recipe list to load a list of recipes, and you remember the previous test I had was for an empty list. And that empty list is there because when the list is initially loaded, it hasn't made that asynchronous request to the server. So when it makes the asynchronous request and the data comes back, then I expect this to be populated with those recipes. So how do I test that? Well, in my set immediate block, then I have my expectation, which is I expect my unordered list to have list items of length equal to 2. So again, I've come from my React Test Utils method to get my unordered list, and then I'm straight away into the DOM API to find those elements. So this is all of my React tests look like this. I'll mount the component. I'll maybe call set immediate if it's needed to wait for anything asynchronous. I'll find the DOM element through the React Test Utils API, and then I'll move into the DOM API and test on that. So a couple other methods. Clicks on a link. First link. I create loads of things, little helper methods like this. What's the first link on the page? It's in the unordered list. I call query selector all, find list items with A tags, and I take the first one. So that recipe list where I had that list of links, that's just taking the first one from the top of the list. And so on my test, if I want to simulate clicking the first link, I literally write click first link. So my test is very descriptive. So I've mounted my component and at the end of the queue, so when the list has rendered. So I've basically said I'm mounting the component, initially it's going to be empty, but at some point the server is going to return with its data, the list will be rendered, then I can click on the first link. Now, my code then is going to go away and load the next recipe. So I have another set immediate. And this is one of the difficulties with this approach. You kind of got this chain of set immediates. And then in there I've got my expectation. And here I've got this recipe function. A recipe is actually a different component. So there's another method to test for different components, for a React component. So I've got a recipe list, and I've now got a recipe component inside it, which we'll come back to and look at that in a little bit. But the reason I wanted to show this test is because this test is about making a change to the UI. So it's before we just had render tests, it was kind of static data, nothing changed. Now we've got a test where you click the link as a user and the state of the screen changes. So in React we have to handle that with state. So to make this test pass, which is clicking on something in the recipe list and a new recipe appearing on the left, I have to use React state. And the key about using React state is you never want to test state. So state is like your private member variables. You never actually, it's not the thing you're testing. With React, you really want to get away from the framework as quickly as possible. And with many frameworks, people have a tendency to lock themselves into it. They write all their code inside of the React components, and they test state. These are things you shouldn't do. Your React components should just deal with the React stuff. And you shouldn't test the React stuff. You should test the HTML, because that's what you really care about. You care about the HTML being rendered. And with the test at the very start, where we looked at the ingredients list and formatting those ingredients, none of that was React code. That was my business logic. And as much of that as possible, I'm going to pull out of React. It's not going to be in these classes. It's just going to be in standard, vanilla JavaScript functions.